Greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa. My name is Ighsaan. I'm the coordinator of the Casual Workers Advice Office. The reason for the existence and the emergence of the office is that in the last 20 or so years, we've had the emergence of increasingly forms of precarious work that is replacing the traditional worker who works Monday to Friday, 45-hour week, home the weekend, maybe one or two shifts, and has time then for leisure, time for organization. These precarious workers are increasingly replacing that traditional form of labor. So we've emerged in an attempt to begin to organize these workers, because this form of labor that's emerging, and it's a global phenomenon, is increasingly undermining the traditional unions. In the South African context, the unions have struggled to try and organize these workers. So we've emerged as one attempt to begin to organize these precarious workers. We've concentrated on one particular form of precarious work that's emerged, which is agency work. These are workers who work for a labor agency, but the labor agency doesn't produce anything. It simply on-sells the workers to big client companies. And these companies would be global companies. We're talking here Kellogg's, PepsiCo, Heineken, Ferrero, companies like that, big global companies. And we're talking about big national companies. These workers are characterized by the fact that they have no job security. They tend to earn easily something like 40 to 50% less than workers who are permanent workers doing exactly the same kind of work. They don't qualify for the allowances. Employers will use things like even just dressing them physically in a different uniform. They have separate canteens. So these are the kinds of workers that we've attempted to organize in the last couple of years. We estimate that something like 1.5 million of just these agency workers within the labor force, estimated liberally at about 12 million workers. So it's not an insignificant number, and the ratios are growing. The way we've gone about trying to organize the workers is that after the state introduced some legislative protection for these workers around about 2015, we started awareness raising amongst these workers, who are mainly young workers, no experience of unionization, no organizing experience even just in their social lives, not aware of their rights. We undertook an awareness raising program amongst these workers. And what followed was a very high degree of self-organization. These workers then started organizing themselves in their workplaces. They started coming forward. And we then started referring disputes to the various industrial tribunals responsible for the enforcement of these workers' rights. The rights were quite fundamental, which explains why the workers responded in the way that they did. The rights, two most important rights were, the first one is that the workers need to be made permanent by these client companies that were using their labor after 3 months. And secondly, these workers then had to be afforded the same rights and benefits that the permanents have. And that, as I say, explains why the workers responded as strongly to the legislative rights as they did. It's not been easy. The levels of organization and self-organization have been high, but the employer responses have been interesting. They have either ignored the law, and that's partly tied to the sort of the fact that the unions have struggled to organize these workers, have struggled to campaign around these rights. So the employers in the main have ignored these rights. Where we have challenged them in the various institutions, legal institutions, they tend to take a whole lot of technical points to drag out the disputes. They take them on review, they take them on appeal. The one important case went as far as the Constitutional Court, and that sort of took 2 years. In that time, what the employers do, obviously, is to intimidate the workers, victimize them. So we've had cases where by the time the issue comes to the labor court, none of the workers are left. They've all been dismissed. So there's been a lot of resistance from employers. And in fact, the employers are even now beginning to go beyond forms of agency work, at a point when we're still experimenting of how best to organize these workers, for them to clarify the response to things like the employers claiming to be service providers who are not bound by these laws, when we're still grappling with the substantive responses to these kinds of changes in the labour market, the employers are already finding alternative ways of finding cheaper labour. So for example, they will now use these workers for 2 months at a time. And you can be working there for 3 years and they employ you for 2 months. And then they tell you to stay home. And you can do that, as I say, for years. Then they bring you back into work. So the employers are already beginning to find ways around agency work. They say these workers are project workers. So you're working on a certain production line or a certain product for maybe 9 months. And then they say, well, your contract is now over because you were just a project worker. So those have been some of the problems, the ways in which these employers are trying to get around the law and the rights that these workers have. What's also bedeviling efforts at organising these workers is that increasingly workers are working shifts. It would be interesting to know if this is a global phenomenon or this is taking place in Europe, for example. Increasingly there's shift work, so you find that workers find it very difficult to formulate and phrase common demands, to have a common struggle. There's a lot of suspicion, lots of disunity. There's also what we're finding here increasingly, again it would be interesting to know how this plays itself out globally. We're finding increasingly that there are variable hours of work. So you're not guaranteed. The old permanent worker used to work Monday to Friday. You now work variable hours. You might work today, you might work again on Friday, you might not work the whole of next week. You might then work a full week the week after. And for workers, that means you have no certainty about when you're going to work. You have no certainty about income. You can't make any commitments to anything on the financial side. Your income fluctuates. Socially, you can't participate in normal working class social life. You can't be members of your church choir or your soccer club because you don't know if you're going to be working or not working. Weekends are now working time. For most workers, that's an ordinary working day. So going to your church on a Sunday, going to your funeral society on a Sunday, that's not a given anymore. Coming to a meeting of workers like we have here every second Saturday, that's not a given. So you come to maybe every alternative meeting. You've lost thread of what's been discussed, what's been decided. You're not part of struggles around solidarity. So there's an interrupted process even of just participating in your organization. So those are some of the difficulties that contribute towards organizing. It adds to the fear that workers have that they're going to be victimized, they're going to be dismissed, if they begin to organize around their rights. So those are some of the difficulties. It is not easy to see where this kind of organizing is going to go because you're dealing with shifting sands. It's not like you're dealing with a finished form of precarious work. And that's now you're organizing. These forms of precarious work are still evolving. We have something here called learnerships, where the idea behind it is that a young person who's unemployed can gain some experience, and that makes them more marketable, more employable into the future. The employers are now using that form of labor as a substitute for agency work. These workers are not covered, these learners are not covered by the new legislation. They're not covered by the national minimum wage. So it's just, again, a cheaper and cheaper form of labor. So to try and organize and distill from that organizing experience what works and what doesn't work, it's very difficult because we're in such a fluid state still. It's of course necessary to defend the old permanent jobs. You know, the worker who worked Monday to Friday, who was earning a relatively stable income, who had won through their organizing, their unionization, had won certain benefits like medical aid and provident fund. It's important to defend that, of course. But the way in which we do that is not clear. You know, what organizational form do we do that? We see how the unions are struggling globally. Is that sufficient? Do we bring these new workers into that form of organization? Do we bring them into new organizations that ally with these traditional organizations? These are big global questions, and there are no easy answers for them. Our sense is that it's going to be a period of experimentation, of testing out, and not being too dogmatic either way, of saying the old has now outlived itself, and we definitely need to have everything brand new, And nor should we be too quick to say that it must be something, as I say, brand new. So the challenges are enormous. It's a question of our attitude is that let's test out with workers what works, what doesn't work. Let's not be too quick to discard what might have worked before. And equally, let's not be too quick to embrace and try to generalize things that might be working, because we find that some of the gains we make are quite elusive. So our general approach is to keep an open mind, to put everything on the table for debate and scrutiny, and see how we go forward.